irrepressible, which is a kind of a standard horror trope. And I'm kind of cheating a little bit by doing that, but just so that you realize I'm aware of my shell game here. I want you to understand that this kind of outlying example is what these people are worried about becoming mainstream. And it's connected to the ideas of the models, instrumentalities that I've been talking about. I know I've given you examples from science fiction and horror movies, stuff that probably doesn't seem incredibly connected to this. But that's the whole point of this talk, is to show that there are these connections. So will we find ourselves in a situation like this? Again, 28 days later, it's a zombie movie. I know, but it's a compelling setup. And so let's imagine a global surveillance mechanism that tracks every individual, their DNA, their actions. It seems all too likely to me. Not as a terrible outcome, but as a disciplinary and prophylactic healthcare regime that might be the only way we can survive and avoid these kinds of outcomes. Now, I know this is fraught with ethical dilemma. Do we really want to allow everyone to be tracked? It's essentially what happens in the Code 46 setup, Winterbottom's film. And of course, in Rainbow's End, there's an enormous amount of transparency and porosity. I'd say this is what's at stake for biopolitics, governance, individual and collective sovereignty. It's a balance between rights, consciousness, and survival in a world where viruses are living in us, waves are passing through us, cultures are thriving in new technologies, and so forth. So what are the technologies that are driving this in the near future? Well, the IPv6 internet address space, for one, is something that you've heard of, but when you think about the vastness of the numbers, it becomes somewhat stunning. That there's about 5 times 10 to the 28th addresses per person available, each one of us, across an IPv6 space. I mean, this is not to say that we each have them and use them, but that's how big the data space is. You can easily tag every tree in every city in the world. And there are people who are trying to do stuff like that. Liz Barry is working on stuff like that. Liz and Leaf, Public Laboratory, tree kit people. Literally every tree in every city in the world. So what do you do in that kind of context? What kind of political agency emerges? The term massive addressability is a term that I've taken from Michael Whitmore's work. He looks at Shakespeare and does data mining and pattern recognition stuff on Shakespeare's work. But it's a really compelling idea in the context of IPv6. You could say that actually massive addressability is a kind of defining characteristic of the world that we live in today, when through the Internet of Things, this oft-used term, cities, buildings, materials, objects, creatures, sites, books, words, molecules, all act as agents together and communicate with each other in what you could call a reciprocal ontology, where everything can find everything. Bruce Sterling called one version of this the spine, the space-time object, right? What's a spine? A spine is something like this bottle, where the bottle and the liquid it contains and the nutrition it delivers to me is less valuable than all the information that hovers around the bottle. Not just the graphic design of the bottle, but the information about how many units there were sold in New York versus London today versus across the entire past 6 months. That becomes the value. The spine is defined entirely by that halo of information and much less by the material object. So the ontological status of a body or an entity or a system changes when you have all of these connective points, multiple in-outs, basically. The sense that gets built into bodies, if we think of them as actors in a network, works to develop a very weird ontology and very weird rules for classifying and remixing the substance of the world. I really like Charles Strauss's book, Rule 34, because he tries to play with that. He has a good sense of humor, like he does in Accelerando. You kind of ask, what would a world be if every component in the world that had a reliable name, in other words, had an address, was findable and intelligent, could reach out and find something else? So that's the kind of technological aspect of what might be at stake. I'm going to skip over.
Nuestro planeta húmedo tiene una sola mancha marrón donde no existe ningún grado de humedad. Es el inmenso desierto de Atacama. Me imagino que el hombre alcanzará pronto el planeta Marte. El suelo que tengo bajo mis pies es lo más parecido a ese mundo lejano. No hay nada, no hay insectos, no hay animales, no hay pájaros. Sin embargo, está lleno de historia. Durante 10.000 años ha sido una tierra de pasaje, de tránsito. Los ríos de piedra servían como caminos naturales. Las caravanas de llamas y hombres iban y venían desde el altiplano hasta el mar. Es una tierra castigada, impregnada de sal, donde los restos humanos se momifican y los objetos permanecen. El aire, transparente, delgado, nos permite leer en este gran libro abierto de la memoria, hoja por hoja. Los telescopios son la puerta del cosmos. Aquí comienza el misterio celeste. En el brillo de la noche, las estrellas nos observan.
So I want to make one more point in conclusion. I'm going to show you two more clips from this film. You could say that contemporary critical work on forensics restages the connections between living systems, quasi-living systems, and the kind of jurisdictional and legal mechanisms which we activate when we have the patience and rigor that someone like Michel Foucault had to conduct our genealogies across all kinds of scales and with empathy for and detachment from our subjects. In this film, the subject is the cosmos, and simultaneously thousands of people who were killed by the Pinochet regime and buried in the Atacama Desert. So the apparatus of war and its aftermath. And this film goes back and forth between interviewing the astronomers, the astrophysicists, and looking at the work that they're doing, and spending time with the women who are still walking through this desert 2 decades later, looking for the bones of the people that were taken from them, and still finding the bones. They're still walking through a desert and finding bones of people that they lost. It's a remarkable piece of work, the film, because it, to me, doesn't trivialize the paralleling of this cosmological investigation with the investigation of what's happening on the planet.
¿Qué piensas tú de esas mujeres que en el desierto todavía buscan los restos de sus familiares, escalan y siguen trabajando?
Bueno, tratando de hacer una comparación, que no se puede comparar porque no tiene nada que ver, pero es parecido a lo que hace un astrónomo con una diferencia muy grande, que nosotros podemos dormir tranquilos después de cada noche de observación mirando el pasado, buscando algo que está en el pasado, podemos dormir tranquilos. A veces dormimos un poco mal porque es muy seco el aire, qué sé yo, pero dormimos tranquilos y al día siguiente volvemos al pasado sin conflicto, sin nada. Pero yo creo que esas mujeres no van a dormir después de buscar, en los restos, digamos, tratando de buscar un pasado que no encuentran. Nunca van a dormir tranquilos mientras no encuentren eso. Y yo creo que esa es la gran diferencia. O sea, no es comparable. curioso es que la sociedad debería entender mucho más a las mujeres que buscan eso, que a los astrónomos. Y pasa al revés. La sociedad entiende mucho más a los astrónomos, yo diría, en esa búsqueda en el pasado, que a las mujeres que buscan estos restos. Hay una suerte como de alergia a eso, y eso es lo que a mí me preocupa eso. Uno escucha de repente, no, pero si ya pasó tanto tiempo, ¿qué más? Y yo creo que no es posible, o sea, mientras no encuentren a los seres que ellos, a sus familiares que están ahí, digamos, nunca van a tener paz. Entonces, hay que estar en la... Yo no me puedo imaginar una cosa así, digamos. O sea, yo a veces me trato de imaginar tener una hermana, un hermano, o un papá, o qué sé yo, que está en alguna parte del desierto, en esa inmensidad. Para mí sería igual, o sea, si yo tuviera la misma vida de ahora, el nexo que haría es que mi padre o mi madre están en el espacio, perdido en algún lugar de la galaxia, y yo estaría tratando de encontrarlo con los telescopios. Sentiría eso, pero la angustia sería muy grande, porque el espacio es tan grande que encontrarlo sería casi imposible. Yo creo que a la mujer le pasa lo mismo. El desierto de Atacama, por ejemplo, es una cosa gigantesca. Quizás, ¿dónde están?
Comparados con la inmensidad del cosmos, los problemas de los chilenos podrían considerarse insignificantes. Pero si los colocáramos encima de una mesa, serían tan grandes como una galaxia. Haciendo esta película, mirando hacia atrás, estas bolitas también me recuerdan la inocencia de Chile cuando yo era niño. En esa época, cada uno de nosotros podía guardar en el fondo de sus bolsillos el universo entero. Yo creo que la memoria tiene fuerza de gravedad, siempre nos atrae. Los que tienen memoria son capaces de vivir en el frágil tiempo presente. Los que no la tienen no viven en ninguna parte.
So this is finishing with a kind of
Cada noche, lentamente,
urgent question.
impasible, el centro de la galaxia pasa por encima de Santiago.
In the context of what happened in Chile, in the context of the technologies that we are unwittingly using, rewinding to examples from Charles Strauss, from Brunner, what kind of agencies are we building out for ourselves? And if we make the same mistakes that we've been making for thousands of years, what kind of future are we determining for ourselves? So, if I go back to the very beginning of this talk, the question of a techno-political future is tied to the agency that people have in the landscape within which they move, and the way that they take models that they either critically use or uncritically use and deploy them across that landscape. So we've seen examples where we really don't know how to navigate the landscape. We've seen examples where there's been an attempt to build models. I've shown you those attempts as attempts that fail, because I don't know what model can be 100% successful. And then I've shown you a little bit about what the consequences could be, given both what we have done in the past, which is what Guzman is looking at in Nostalgia for the Light, and also what we're doing right now in terms of our technological acceleration. So it's essentially finishing with a big question for you. What kind of models do you want to build? How do you want to deploy those models as design tools and as tools for thinking? And how can you actually do something as extraordinary as what I think Guzman did in this film, which is mix what I called in a talk earlier this week, skepticism and wonder. It really mixes skepticism, critical thinking, and wonder in equal amounts to produce something quite interesting. So I think we're already really out of time. I'll just leave that quote from William S. Burroughs up there. Thanks.